The first wolf arrived at the kitchen window before sunrise. The servant girl thought it was lost. Then another appeared. Then 10 more. Within minutes, the most feared wolves in the Alpha King's kingdom surrounded a place they had never entered before. The kitchen. The same kitchen where a nameless servant worked every day, without a title, without power, and without anyone knowing her name. The nobles laughed when they saw her humming beside the fire. They called her invisible. They believed she was nothing. But the wolves believed something completely different. They lowered their heads outside her window like they had finally found someone they had been searching for their entire lives. The guards tried to remove them. They refused. The generals gave commands. They ignored them. Then the Alpha King himself stepped forward and gave the order no creature had ever dared to question. The oldest wolf in his army looked at him, turned away, and returned to the servant. For the first time in history, the Alpha King faced a terrifying truth. His wolves were not losing loyalty. They were giving it to someone else. Someone the kingdom had forgotten. Someone whose existence could reveal the secret buried beneath the throne itself. Because if the wolves chose her over their king, the question was no longer why they followed her. The question was, what did they know about her that the Alpha King was never meant to discover? The castle belonged to the Alpha King, yet there was one place inside its towering walls that no noble ever noticed. It was the kitchen where the fires never slept and where tired hands worked long before the first light touched the mountains. Every day began with smoke rising into the cold air and the sound of knives against wooden tables. Servants moved like ghosts through the endless heat, carrying heavy baskets and boiling pots, while the royal court dreamed beneath silk blankets. Among those forgotten faces was a young woman whose name no one cared to remember. To the nobles, she was only another servant born to disappear. They never looked at her twice because in their world only power deserved attention. Yet every morning while her hands worked without rest, a soft melody drifted through the kitchen. She hummed the same quiet tune, as if the cruel world outside the walls had never reached her heart. No one understood why she never complained. The older servants whispered that sorrow had taught her silence. The younger ones believed she had simply accepted her place. She carried water from the frozen well before sunrise. She scrubbed blackened pots until her fingers turned red. She baked bread that filled the halls with warmth, yet she never tasted the finest pieces herself. Every smile she offered was ignored. Every act of kindness disappeared into the shadows. The castle consumed people like her every day and gave nothing back. Beyond the great walls, the Alpha Kingdom stretched farther than any traveler could ride in a single season. Dense forests surrounded the fortress like dark oceans of ancient trees. Those forests belonged to the wolves. Not ordinary wolves, but creatures raised beside generations of Alpha Kings. Their loyalty was spoken of like sacred law. They obeyed no one except the ruler, who carried the blood of the first Alpha. Children across distant villages grew up hearing stories that the wolves would throw themselves into death before abandoning their king. No one had ever questioned that truth. The Alpha King himself stood above every soul in the kingdom. His victories had shaped legends. His enemies disappeared before they could threaten his throne. His warriors followed him without hesitation because they believed strength itself had taken human form. Whenever he crossed the fortress courtyard, every servant lowered their eyes. Every soldier straightened their back. Even the wind seemed quieter in his presence. Power surrounded him like an invisible crown that no one dared challenge. Yet power often hides the cracks growing beneath its surface. The nobles celebrated themselves more than they honored their king. They praised his victories with polished words while secretly building walls around the truth. Reports reaching the throne became softer every season. Failures vanished before they could be spoken aloud. Ambitious men climbed higher by feeding the king only what pleased his ears. They believed control came from hiding weakness. They believed loyalty could be demanded forever. The servants noticed things the nobles never did, because invisible people always see what powerful eyes ignore. As another evening settled over the fortress, the kitchen fires burned brighter against the growing darkness. The young woman stood alone, shaping fresh bread with tired hands. Ash rested across her sleeves and loose strands of hair clung to her face. Without thinking, she began humming once more. It was the same melody she had carried since childhood, though even she could no longer remember where she had first heard it. The sound floated gently through the open window and disappeared into the silent forest. Then everything changed. A deep shadow appeared outside the window. One wolf stood watching her. Its silver eyes never blinked. The servants froze. No one moved. No one breathed. The beast should have been guarding the outer walls beside the royal hunters. Instead, it remained perfectly still, as though the quiet melody had pulled it across the entire fortress. The young woman slowly lifted her eyes. Fear should have taken hold of her heart, yet something unexpected happened. The wolf lowered its massive head. Not in hunger, not in warning, in respect. An old servant gasped so softly that the sound almost vanished beneath the crackling fire. Within moments, another wolf emerged from the darkness. Then another. Then another. The kitchen window became surrounded by silent shapes covered in silver and black fur. Their glowing eyes reflected the firelight while none of them made a single threatening movement. They simply listened. The humming continued. Outside, the fortress guards shouted in confusion. Boots pounded across stone pathways. Horns echoed through the night. Soldiers rushed toward the gathering wolves expecting chaos, but found only silence. They waved torches and shouted commands, yet not one beast turned away from the window. Word spread through the castle faster than wildfire. Servants abandoned their work. Guards left their posts. Even proud nobles stepped onto balconies wearing expressions that shifted from annoyance to disbelief. No one had ever seen the royal wolves ignore their duties. Far above the courtyard, the Alpha King stood upon the highest terrace overlooking his fortress. One of his commanders approached with unease written across his face. The commander bowed deeply before speaking. "My king, the wolves have abandoned the northern patrol." The Alpha King frowned only slightly. That had never happened before. Not once. He looked toward the distant glow of the kitchen windows where an impossible gathering waited beneath the night sky. For the first time in many years, a question entered the mind of the man who believed nothing within his kingdom could surprise him. Why were his wolves no longer listening to the kingdom they had sworn to protect? Night settled over the fortress, like a heavy cloak, yet no one inside the castle could sleep. The sound of frightened whispers drifted through the stone halls as servants carried stories from one corner to another. Every version became stranger than the last. Some claimed the wolves had surrounded the kitchen to protect the servant girl. Others believed an ancient curse had returned after centuries of silence. Fear spread quickly, because fear always grows where answers cannot be found. Outside the kitchen, the wolves remained perfectly still. Their breathing rose gently into the cold air. Their ears stayed lifted toward the open window, where the young woman continued her work. She had stopped humming now, yet none of the wolves moved away. They watched her with calm eyes filled not with hunger, but with quiet recognition. It was the kind of look given to someone deeply remembered after a long separation. The servants slowly returned to their work, though every pair of eyes remained fixed on the window. No one dared speak above a whisper. The oldest woman in the kitchen crossed herself with trembling hands before looking toward the young servant. "Child," she whispered, "where did you learn that song?" The young woman looked up in surprise. "I do not know," she answered softly. "I have always known it." The old servant stared at her for a long moment before lowering her eyes. That answer frightened her more than anything else. Far above the kitchens, the Alpha King walked through the highest corridor of the fortress with long, steady steps. Torchlight danced across the walls as guards quickly stepped aside to clear his path. His face remained calm, but his thoughts refused to settle. His wolves had never abandoned their duty. Not during storms. Not during war. Not even when blood covered the battlefield. Yet, tonight they had left their posts without hesitation. His commander followed closely behind. "My king, the northern gate now stands with half its usual guard because the wolves refuse every order." The Alpha King stopped walking. "Has anyone tried forcing them back?" The commander lowered his head. "We tried." None of them growled. None of them attacked. They simply ignored every command. Silence filled the corridor. Ignoring a command from the Alpha King was impossible. It broke every law that had ruled the kingdom for generations. The king turned toward the tall window overlooking the courtyard. In the distance, dozens of torches flickered around the kitchens. Tiny figures moved like shadows while silver wolves remained gathered beneath the warm glow spilling through the window. For the first time in years, uncertainty entered his heart. Not fear. Something deeper. Something colder. A memory. Long ago, when he had still been a child, his father had spoken of forgotten traditions that older kings refused to discuss. Stories about wolves choosing truth instead of power. Stories dismissed as myths by every noble family. He had laughed at those tales back then. Tonight they no longer sounded like myths. Meanwhile, inside the grand dining hall, the royal nobles gathered around long wooden tables covered with rich food and golden cups. Their voices carried confidence, though worry hid beneath every smile. One noble leaned forward. "This servant has become a distraction." Another nodded. "The wolves must have been trained by someone. Someone is trying to weaken the throne." A third noble smiled without warmth. "Then remove the servant, and the problem disappears." Several heads nodded in agreement. To them the answer seemed simple. Power always removed weakness before asking questions. None of them realized they had mistaken innocence for danger. Back in the kitchen, the young woman finished placing fresh loaves onto cooling racks. She wiped flour from her hands and finally gathered enough courage to walk toward the open window. Every servant held their breath. She stopped only a few steps away from the nearest wolf. The great animal slowly rose to its feet. Its size would have terrified any ordinary person. Its shoulders stood almost level with the window itself. The wolf took one careful step closer. Then another. The young woman did not move. Her heartbeat echoed loudly inside her chest. She reached out almost without thinking. Her fingertips rested gently against thick silver fur. Nothing happened. No growl. No attack. The wolf closed its eyes. The other wolves lowered their heads at the same moment. The kitchen became completely silent. Even the fire seemed to burn more quietly. Tears suddenly filled the eyes of the oldest servant. She had lived inside the fortress for 40 years. She had seen kings crowned. She had watched wars begin. She had buried friends forgotten by history. Never once had she witnessed the royal wolves bow to anyone except the Alpha King. Yet tonight they bowed before a servant. Outside the kitchen, soldiers tightened their grip on their spears. No one understood what they were seeing. Some believed they should protect the girl. Others believed they should arrest her. No one dared make the first move. High above them, the Alpha King watched everything from the shadows of the upper balcony. He had expected chaos. Instead, he saw peace. The wolves looked calmer than they had in months. There was no anger in them, only certainty. The king narrowed his eyes. Power built through fear always expected rebellion. Power built through loyalty inspired devotion. For the first time, he wondered whether he truly understood the creatures that had stood beside his bloodline for generations. Behind him, footsteps echoed through the empty corridor. Another commander arrived carrying urgent news. "My king, the Eastern Patrol has reported the same thing. More wolves are leaving the forest. They are all coming here." The Alpha King slowly looked toward the dark tree line beyond the fortress walls. Shapes were emerging from the forest one after another. Large wolves, old wolves, young wolves. Dozens of glowing eyes moved silently through the darkness toward the castle. Not as an army, not as hunters. As if they had answered a call no human ear could hear. The king remained completely still. Deep inside him, something long forgotten began to stir. Because if every wolf in the kingdom was coming to one servant who had never sought power, then this was no accident. It was the beginning of something that could either save his throne or destroy everything his ancestors had built. Darkness had not yet surrendered to dawn when the Alpha King left his chambers, without guards announcing his presence. The fortress still breathed in uneasy silence. Every hallway carried the weight of unanswered questions. Servants walked more carefully than before. Soldiers spoke only when duty demanded it. Even the great banners hanging from the stone walls seemed motionless, as if the castle itself had stopped to listen for something hidden beneath the ordinary sounds of another morning. The king walked alone because for the first time in many years he wanted to see with his own eyes instead of through the words of others. Power had always placed distance between him and the smallest corners of his kingdom. Reports reached his throne polished and perfected until truth became difficult to recognize. This morning he refused every escort. He wanted silence. He wanted honesty. The kitchen fires had already been lit when he reached the lower halls. Warm light spilled through the doorway, while the smell of fresh bread drifted into the cold passage. Inside, the servants moved quickly from one task to another. Their hands never rested. Their backs remained bent beneath endless work. Yet the moment they noticed the Alpha King standing at the entrance, every movement stopped. Fear swept across the room like a sudden winter wind. Every servant lowered their head. Every voice disappeared. Only one person continued working. The young woman stood beside the long wooden table kneading fresh dough with steady hands. She had not seen him yet. Her attention rested completely on the simple task before her. There was no fear in her face because she did not know the ruler of the kingdom had entered the room. The king watched her without speaking. There was nothing unusual about her appearance. No golden jewels. No noble clothing. No hidden symbols of power. Only flour resting across her hands and quiet determination shining through tired eyes. At that moment she began humming again. The same gentle melody floated through the kitchen like sunlight touching frozen water.
Soft, calm,
unchanging. The Alpha King felt something strange move through his chest. Not pain. Not joy. Recognition. It disappeared as quickly as it arrived, leaving behind only confusion. The wolves appeared before anyone could react. One by one they stepped into the courtyard outside the kitchen windows. More than the night before. Their heavy paws made almost no sound against the stone. Some were young and strong while others carried silver fur that spoke of many harsh winters. Every wolf looked toward the young servant with complete attention. No command had summoned them. No horn had called them. They had come because they chose to come. The king slowly walked toward the window. The largest wolf raised its head. Their eyes met. For years this creature had stood beside him during battles that shaped the kingdom. It had followed every order, without hesitation. It had protected his life more times than he could count. Now it looked at him with calm respect. Then it slowly turned its attention back toward the young woman. The king felt no anger, only disbelief. Behind him, one of the kitchen servants whispered with trembling breath, "Your Majesty should leave before something happens." The king answered without taking his eyes from the wolves. "Nothing dangerous is happening here. The danger is that none of us understand why." His voice remained calm, yet every word settled heavily inside the room. The young woman finally turned around. The moment she saw the Alpha King standing only a few steps away, her face turned pale. She immediately lowered her head. "Forgive me, Your Majesty. I did not know you were here." The king studied her carefully. There was no pride inside her. No excitement. No ambition. Only honest surprise. He searched her expression for deception, but found nothing. "What is your name?" Her voice remained soft. "My name is Alara." The king repeated it quietly inside his own mind. A simple name. One he had never heard before despite ruling this fortress for years. How many other people like her had lived their entire lives beneath his roof, without ever reaching his notice. His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of another commander. The soldier hurried across the courtyard, breathing heavily before kneeling. "My king, scouts have returned from the northern forest. Every wolf pack has abandoned its hunting grounds. They are all moving toward the fortress." The words struck every person standing nearby. The servants looked at one another with frightened eyes. The king remained perfectly still. "How many?" The commander swallowed hard. "Hundreds." Silence answered him. Even the morning birds outside had stopped singing. The Alpha King slowly lifted his eyes toward the distant mountains rising beyond the forest. Somewhere beneath those endless trees, something had awakened. Something ancient enough to command every wolf without force. His mind returned to the stories told by his father. Stories dismissed by proud nobles as childish legends. There had once been a bond stronger than commands. Stronger than blood. A bond that could never be claimed through fear. Only through truth. He had forgotten those words long ago. Now they returned with frightening clarity. Across the upper balconies, several nobles watched everything unfold from a safe distance. Their expressions hardened. One leaned closer to another. The king is beginning to believe the servant matters. The second noble narrowed his eyes. Then we must make certain she never speaks to him alone again. Neither of them noticed another figure listening from the shadows behind a stone pillar. The oldest librarian in the fortress slowly closed an ancient book resting beneath his arm. His weathered face had turned completely pale. He had spent decades protecting forgotten histories that no king had bothered to read. This morning he recognized the melody. Not from memory. From the oldest pages ever written inside the kingdom. His hands trembled, because the song was never meant to be heard again. It belonged to an age before the first Alpha King wore a crown. And if the wolves had answered that forgotten call after centuries of silence, then the kingdom was no longer standing at the edge of an ordinary mystery. It was standing at the beginning of a truth powerful enough to rewrite everything its people believed about their own throne. The old librarian did not wait for permission. He walked through the silent corridors with surprising speed despite the weight of his years. Dust rose beneath every step as he climbed the narrow staircase, leading to the forgotten archives hidden beneath the highest tower. Few people remembered those rooms still existed. Even fewer had entered them. Shelves taller than soldiers disappeared into darkness. Ancient scrolls rested beneath layers of dust untouched for generations. The air carried the scent of old parchment and fading ink. Every forgotten page held memories that the kingdom itself had chosen to bury. His shaking hands searched through one wooden shelf after another until he finally stopped before a thick leather-bound volume sealed with faded silver thread. He lifted it carefully as though the book itself carried a heartbeat. The cover bore no title, only the carved image of a wolf resting beneath an ancient tree. Slowly, he opened the first pages. His tired eyes moved across words written in a language almost no living soul could read. The symbols felt familiar because he had spent his entire life protecting knowledge others considered useless. As he translated each line, his breathing became slower. The forgotten song. The wolves who answer, without command. The return of the silent voice. Every sentence pointed toward the same impossible truth. Far below the tower, the Alpha King remained standing outside the kitchen. He dismissed his commanders with a single wave of his hand. Their questions continued to echo behind him, yet he wanted no advice. Advice had become dangerous inside a court where ambition wore the mask of loyalty. He looked once more toward Alara. She had returned to her work exactly as before. Her hands shaped bread with quiet patience while the wolves remained resting outside the windows. She acted as though nothing extraordinary surrounded her. That simple honesty disturbed him more than fear ever could. Power usually attracted those hungry for more. She carried none of that hunger. The king stepped closer. Alara. She lifted her eyes carefully. Yes, your majesty. When did you first notice the wolves? She lowered her gaze as she searched her memory. I cannot remember the exact day. One appeared many weeks ago. Then another. They never frightened me. They simply listened. The king remained silent. Do you know why? She slowly shook her head. I wish I did. Sometimes when I sing they seem peaceful. That is all I know. There was no lie hidden inside her answer. He had questioned spies and kings throughout his life. He understood the smallest signs of deception. Her voice carried none. Before another word could be spoken, heavy footsteps echoed across the courtyard. A noble lord arrived surrounded by armed guards wearing polished armor bright enough to reflect the morning sun. His sharp eyes moved immediately toward the wolves before settling upon Alara. Your Majesty, this servant should be removed at once. The king turned slowly. Explain. The noble straightened proudly. These creatures no longer obey the throne. Their behavior began after her arrival. Whether by magic or manipulation, she threatens the kingdom. Several nearby nobles nodded with eager agreement. The Alpha King studied their faces one by one. He noticed something beyond concern.
Fear.
Not fear of the wolves. Fear of losing control. The king spoke quietly. Have the wolves harmed anyone?
No.
Have they attacked the fortress?
No.
Have they disobeyed my commands in battle?
No.
The noble hesitated. Not yet. The Alpha King took one slow step forward. Then you ask me to punish an innocent servant because you fear what you cannot explain. The courtyard fell silent. No one had expected him to defend her. The noble lowered his eyes, though resentment remained burning beneath his calm expression. As the meeting ended, he bowed respectfully before walking away. The moment he disappeared behind the stone archway, his respectful mask vanished. He stopped inside a quiet corridor where two trusted allies waited. "The king is beginning to doubt us," one of them answered in a whisper. "Then we must act before his doubt becomes belief." The noble nodded slowly. "Tonight. No witnesses. No mistakes." Far away from listening ears, their plan quietly took shape. Back inside the ancient archive, the old librarian finally reached the final chapter of the forgotten book. His face lost all remaining color. The passage spoke not of kings, not of crowns, not of noble blood. It spoke of the first voice. A soul born without title whose heart carried perfect harmony with the wolves of the ancient world. The old stories claimed such a person appeared only when the kingdom itself had lost its way. The wolves would leave even their king if that voice returned, because their loyalty had never belonged to power alone. It belonged to truth. The old man slowly closed the book. His hands would not stop trembling. If these words were real, then the throne itself had misunderstood its own history for centuries. Outside the fortress walls, the forests continued to awaken. More wolves crossed rivers. More climbed rocky hills. Entire packs moved silently toward the castle, without hunting, without resting, without fear. The people living in nearby villages watched in stunned silence as hundreds of wolves passed without harming a single person. Children stood beside their parents, staring at the endless procession disappearing toward the distant fortress. Rumors spread faster than the wolves themselves. Some believed the end of the kingdom had arrived. Others believed the ancient guardians had finally chosen a new path. Inside the castle, the Alpha King stood alone upon the highest balcony as evening covered the land once more. He watched the forest breathing beneath the fading light. For the first time since wearing the crown, he questioned whether ruling the kingdom had also meant forgetting the truth that created it. Behind him, soft footsteps approached. The old librarian fell to one knee while holding the ancient book against his chest. "Your Majesty, I have found something that your ancestors hid from every generation after them." The Alpha King turned slowly. The old man's eyes were filled not with excitement, but with dread. Because some truths were powerful enough to save a kingdom, and powerful enough to destroy a dynasty. The old librarian slowly rose from his knee while the evening wind carried the distant howls of wolves across the mountains. The sound rolled through the valley like an ancient prayer returning after centuries of silence. The Alpha King remained still. His eyes never left the old book pressed tightly against the librarian's chest. Every instinct told him that whatever was written inside those faded pages would change the kingdom forever. The librarian opened the book with careful hands. His fingers rested upon a worn page whose edges had nearly turned to dust. "Your Majesty, these records were sealed by your own ancestors. Every king after the first dynasty was forbidden to read them. The truth became a burden too dangerous for those who feared losing power." The Alpha King stepped closer. "Then speak the truth." The old man drew a slow breath. The first Alpha King never ruled because the wolves obeyed him. He ruled because he obeyed the balance they protected. Silence settled between them. The words sounded simple, yet they struck harder than any blade. The librarian continued. "The wolves never belonged to the crown. They guarded the spirit of the kingdom itself. Whenever pride replaced wisdom, they searched for the first voice, the one whose heart still remembered what kings had forgotten." The Alpha King lowered his eyes for a single moment. His father had once tried to tell him something similar when he was still a boy. He remembered sitting beside a fire while the old king spoke about humility before strength. At the time, he believed such lessons belonged to peaceful days, not to rulers carrying the weight of an empire. Now those forgotten words returned with painful clarity. Far below the tower, another story had already begun. The noble lord who had demanded Alara's removal stood inside a hidden chamber beneath the eastern wing of the fortress. Only a few trusted allies surrounded him. Thick stone walls swallowed every whispered word. He placed both hands upon a wooden table covered with maps of the kingdom. "The king is changing," one man answered quietly. "He is asking questions instead of giving orders." Another spoke with growing concern. "If he discovers the truth about the old bloodlines, our influence will end." The noble's face hardened. "Then we make certain the servant disappears before sunrise. No witnesses. No mercy." The room fell silent. None of them smiled. This was no longer politics. It had become survival. Back inside the kitchens, Alara prepared the final meal of the evening while the fortress slowly settled into darkness. The other servants had begun leaving one after another until only the oldest woman remained beside her. The old servant watched Alara for a long time before speaking.
"Child,
"Have you ever wondered who your parents truly were?" Alara looked up in surprise. "I was told they died when I was very young." The old woman nodded slowly. "That is what everyone was told." Her voice carried sadness deeper than words. "There were rumors long ago. Your mother also sang. The wolves followed her too." Alara stopped moving. She searched the old woman's face. "Why has no one ever told me this before?" "Because speaking of it became dangerous. People vanished after asking too many questions." The room became painfully quiet. Alara suddenly realized how little she truly knew about her own life. Every memory before the orphanage felt distant and blurred like a dream disappearing with the morning sun. Outside, another wolf quietly approached the kitchen door. Unlike the others, this one carried scars across its face earned through many battles. Its golden eyes rested upon Alara with patient calm. The old servant whispered, "It has been waiting for you since sunset." Alara slowly walked outside. Cold evening air wrapped around her as she stepped into the courtyard. Dozens of wolves rested across the stone ground without making a sound. None blocked her path. None demanded anything from her. The scarred wolf turned and began walking toward the fortress gardens. After several steps it looked back, waiting, almost inviting. Alara hesitated only a moment before following. The path wound between ancient trees older than the kingdom itself. Moonlight slipped through the branches, painting silver patterns across the ground. The farther they walked, the quieter the world became, until only the soft sound of leaves remained. The wolf finally stopped before a massive oak standing alone at the edge of the garden. Its roots rose from the earth like ancient hands. Alara stepped closer. Something caught her eye. Hidden beneath layers of moss rested a weathered stone carved with the same symbol she had seen upon the librarian's old book. A wolf beneath a great tree. Her heartbeat quickened. Without thinking, she brushed away the moss. More carvings appeared. Words. Names. One name made her breath stop. Her own family name. She stared in disbelief. How could it be here? Before she could understand, another sound broke the silence. Footsteps. Several figures emerged from the darkness between the trees. Armed men. Faces hidden beneath dark hoods. The scarred wolf immediately stepped in front of Alara. Its low growl echoed through the silent garden. The leader slowly drew his sword. His voice remained cold. "Do not make this difficult." Alara took one frightened step backward. She understood nothing except one terrible truth. These men had not come to ask questions. They had come to make sure she never discovered another answer. High above the gardens, the Alpha King suddenly looked toward the forest. A single desperate howl shattered the stillness of the night. It was not a call of anger. It was a warning. And before the echo had faded, the Alpha King was already running toward the sound. The warning howl rolled across the fortress, like thunder breaking through a clear sky. Every wolf lifted its head at the same instant. Every guard froze where he stood. Every torch seemed to flicker as if the night itself had heard the cry. The Alpha King did not hesitate. His boots struck the stone steps with powerful rhythm as he rushed through the lower halls. Guards hurried to follow, but he raised one hand, without slowing. "Stay behind." His command echoed through the corridor. This was not a battle that required an army. Something deeper waited in the darkness. The fortress garden stretched beneath the moon like a forgotten world. Ancient trees swayed gently as cold wind whispered through their branches. The Alpha King crossed the stone bridge leading into the gardens and immediately noticed broken leaves scattered across the ground. Fresh footprints marked the soft earth. Someone had entered these sacred grounds with purpose. Another low growl reached his ears. He followed the sound. Beyond the great oak he saw the scarred wolf standing firmly before Alara. Its body remained perfectly still, yet every muscle carried silent warning. Across from them the hooded men slowly spread apart, forming a circle. Their swords reflected pale moonlight. The leader smiled beneath his hood. "Your Majesty, you arrived sooner than expected." The Alpha King looked at the armed strangers without drawing his own weapon. "Who sent you?" The man laughed softly. "The answer would only disappoint you." The king understood immediately. These were not enemies from another kingdom. They belonged to his own. Betrayal had crossed the walls of his fortress. One of the hooded men suddenly stepped forward. The scarred wolf moved before anyone could breathe. It struck the attacker with terrifying speed, sending the sword spinning into the darkness. The remaining wolves burst from the trees like silver shadows. They surrounded Alara in perfect silence, forming a living wall between her and the assassins. None attacked blindly. None chased. They simply protected. The Alpha King watched with growing realization. The wolves were not obeying panic. They were following purpose. The hooded leader slowly lowered his blade. "Interesting. Even now they choose her over you." The words landed heavily inside the king's heart. For years he would have answered such insult with anger. Tonight he answered with thought.
Perhaps they are trying to teach me something.
The assassin hesitated. That single sentence shattered the confidence in his eyes. The Alpha King had not reacted as expected. He had changed. Without warning, another whistle pierced the night. Hidden archers emerged upon the nearby walls. Arrows rained toward the garden. Before the first arrow reached the ground, something extraordinary happened. The wolves moved together, as though sharing one mind. Some leaped before Alara. Others shielded the Alpha King. Several charged toward the archers with breathtaking speed. Chaos erupted for only a heartbeat. Then silence returned. The surviving attackers fled into the darkness, abandoning their weapons behind them. The Alpha King made no attempt to chase them. He watched the wolves instead. Not one had protected itself first. Every movement had been made to protect another. The lesson stood plainly before his eyes. True strength was never selfish. As the garden grew quiet, Alara slowly approached the great oak once more. Her hands still trembled from fear, yet something stronger pulled her toward the weathered stone beneath the roots. The Alpha King walked beside her. Together they looked upon the ancient carving. His eyes settled upon the family name etched into the old stone. He recognized it immediately. It belonged to one of the oldest bloodlines in the kingdom, a family believed to have vanished generations ago. The king frowned. "This cannot be." Alara whispered without looking away. "It is my name." The words felt almost unreal. The Alpha King knelt beside the stone and brushed away more dirt with his hand. Additional carvings slowly appeared beneath centuries of earth. There was another inscription. Not a name. A warning. The first voice shall never wear a crown. The first voice shall guide the one who does. The king read the words twice. Then a third time. His breathing slowed. Every belief carried by the royal court had been built upon incomplete history. The throne had never been meant to stand alone. Behind them, the old librarian finally arrived, carrying the ancient book beneath his arm. His face showed no surprise at the carving. He bowed his head. "I feared we would find this." The Alpha King looked toward him. "You knew." The old man nodded sadly. "Only fragments. Never the full truth. The book speaks of two guardians. One carries the crown. The other carries the voice. Separated they weaken. Together the kingdom prospers." Alara stood in complete silence. Nothing about her life made sense anymore. She had spent years believing she was nobody, a forgotten servant, an invisible soul. Now every answer uncovered another mystery. The Alpha King slowly rose to his feet. He looked toward Alara not as a servant, but as someone standing beside the future of the kingdom. For the first time since wearing the crown, he understood that leadership did not mean standing above everyone else. It meant standing beside those chosen by truth. Far away inside the eastern wing, the noble lord listened as one wounded assassin collapsed before him. "The servant still lives." The king protected her himself. The noble closed his eyes. His greatest fear had become reality. The Alpha King had stopped listening only to his court. He had begun listening to the truth. That made him far more dangerous than the warrior who had conquered kingdoms. Slowly the noble opened a hidden chest beneath his table. Inside rested an ancient royal seal stolen many years before. A seal powerful enough to summon every lord across the realm.
He picked it up with steady hands.
If quiet murder had failed, then only one path remained. The kingdom would not wake to another ordinary morning. It would wake to the beginning of a civil war. The first rays of dawn had not yet touched the mountains when the fortress awoke to the sound of iron bells. Their deep voices rolled across the valley again and again until every window opened and every soldier rushed toward the walls. It was not the call for celebration. It was not the warning of a foreign invasion. It was the ancient signal that every lord of the kingdom recognized. The royal seal had been used. Someone with authority had summoned the noble houses to gather beneath the banner of judgment. The Alpha King stood upon the highest balcony, watching the fortress come alive beneath him. Hundreds of soldiers crossed the courtyards with hurried steps. Horses were prepared before the stables. Messengers rode through the open gates, carrying sealed letters toward every province of the realm. The entire kingdom had begun moving before the sun itself had risen. Behind him the old librarian approached with quiet concern. "Your Majesty, they have acted faster than expected." The king never looked away from the awakening fortress. "They fear truth more than they fear me." The old man lowered his head. "That makes desperate men dangerous." The Alpha King nodded slowly. "It also makes them careless." For the first time since these strange events had begun, his mind felt clear. Every unanswered question had sharpened his judgment instead of weakening it. He no longer saw scattered mysteries. He saw one carefully woven design. Every lie spoken inside the royal court had protected the same secret. Every attempt to silence Alara had served the same purpose. Someone had spent years hiding the true foundation of the kingdom. Far below the balcony, Alara stood inside the quiet chapel hidden beneath the western tower. Morning light slipped through tall stained glass windows, painting soft colors across the stone floor. She had never entered this place before. Servants rarely had reason to come here. The silence wrapped around her like gentle rain. She walked toward the oldest mural covering the far wall. It showed the first Alpha King standing beside a great wolf beneath a towering tree. She had seen similar images before. Yet something was different. The figure standing beside the king was no warrior. It was a young woman. She carried no crown, no weapon, only one hand resting upon the wolf. Alara stepped closer. Time had faded most of the painting, yet one sentence remained untouched beneath the ancient colors. "Strength protects. Wisdom guides. Neither survives alone." She whispered the words to herself. Something inside her heart stirred. Not memory, recognition. As though those words had waited her entire life to be spoken aloud. Outside the chapel, footsteps echoed through the corridor. The Alpha King entered quietly. He noticed the mural immediately. His eyes rested upon the forgotten woman standing beside the first Alpha King. How many times had he passed through this chapel without truly seeing it? Countless times. Power often blinded those who believed they already understood everything before them. Alara looked toward him. "Your Majesty, was she real?" The king studied the painting before answering. "I believe she was. And I believe history chose to forget her." His words carried sadness rather than anger. They stood together in silence, while sunlight slowly filled the chapel. Neither noticed the pair of eyes watching them through the narrow doorway. A young palace guard quietly stepped away from the shadows. His loyalty had never belonged to the throne. Within moments he disappeared into the lower halls, carrying news toward the eastern wing. There the noble lord waited inside his private chamber, surrounded by maps and sealed letters. Every passing minute brought another messenger carrying reports from across the kingdom. The guard dropped to one knee. "My lord, the king and the servant are together." The noble smiled for the first time that morning.
"Good.
Let every lord arriving today believe exactly what I want them to believe." He walked toward a large wooden chest resting beneath the window. Inside lay dozens of carefully forged documents carrying the royal seal. False decrees. False accusations. False evidence. Years of preparation rested inside that single chest. He lifted one parchment. Today the kingdom will believe the king has betrayed his ancestors. The guard hesitated. And if they do not believe it, the noble folded the parchment with calm hands. Then they will fear it. Fear is often stronger than truth. Meanwhile, the great gates of the fortress slowly opened. The first noble houses arrived beneath banners of silver and black. Long lines of mounted warriors crossed the stone bridge, while servants rushed to welcome them. More banners appeared beyond the hills with every passing hour. The strongest families in the kingdom had answered the royal summons without knowing who had truly called them. Inside the central courtyard, whispers spread like wind through dry leaves. Some believed the Alpha King had lost control of the wolves. Others claimed he had fallen under the influence of forbidden magic. Each rumor grew larger before reaching the next listener. Truth struggled to keep pace with lies. The Alpha King watched every arriving lord from the palace steps. He recognized old allies, former rivals, men who had fought beside his father, men who had once sworn loyalty with tears in their eyes. Now he searched every face for honesty. Some lowered their gaze. Some smiled too quickly. Some refused to meet his eyes at all. The wolves had already sensed betrayal. Now the king began sensing it too. Late that afternoon, the great hall filled with nobles from every corner of the realm. Heavy doors closed behind them with a deep echo. Hundreds of eyes turned toward the throne, waiting for the Alpha King to speak. Before he could rise, another voice shattered the silence. "Your Majesty, a grave accusation has been placed before this council." The noble lord stepped into the center of the hall holding a sealed scroll high for every lord to see. He broke the seal slowly. His expression remained calm, almost sorrowful, as though he regretted what he was about to reveal. Every noble leaned forward. The Alpha King remained perfectly still, because he already understood one thing. The battle before him would not be fought with swords. It would be fought with belief. And sometimes belief was the deadliest weapon of all. The noble lord unfolded the scroll with slow, careful hands, allowing every eye inside the great hall to follow the movement. Silence covered the chamber so completely that even the flames inside the wall torches seemed afraid to move. Every lord waited. Every soldier standing beside the pillars tightened his grip upon his spear. The Alpha King remained seated upon the throne with calm eyes fixed upon the man who had spent years hiding ambition behind loyalty. The noble raised his voice, so every corner of the hall could hear. "This document carries witness that the Alpha King has abandoned the sacred law of our ancestors. He has placed the future of the kingdom into the hands of a servant whose bloodline has long been forbidden. He has broken the order that protected this realm for generations." A wave of whispers rushed through the gathering. Some faces filled with shock, others with confusion. Several looked toward the Alpha King, searching for denial. The king slowly stood. His movement alone silenced the room. He walked down the long stone steps without hurry until he stood only a few paces from the noble lord. Neither man spoke for several moments. They simply looked at one another. The Alpha King finally extended his hand. "Let me see the scroll." The noble hesitated, only for a heartbeat. Then he offered it with quiet confidence. The king studied every line written across the parchment. His eyes moved slowly from top to bottom. The names appeared convincing. The royal seal looked perfect. The handwriting closely matched the records preserved inside the royal archives. To anyone else, the document would have appeared genuine. Then the Alpha King smiled. Not with pride, not with anger, with certainty. He lifted the scroll before the gathered council. "This seal is false." The words echoed across the chamber. The noble frowned. "Impossible." The king calmly turned the parchment toward the assembled lords. "My father changed the royal seal 15 years ago after traitors copied the older design. Only 3 people knew of the change. Myself, my father, and the royal librarian." The hall exploded into restless voices. The noble stared at the parchment, now resting inside the king's hand. For the first time, uncertainty entered his face. The Alpha King continued. The man who created this forgery never realized the hidden mark inside the true seal was changed. He looked directly into the noble's eyes. You built your accusation upon history that no longer exists. Silence returned. The noble quickly regained his composure. Even if the seal is false, the servant remains a threat. She has turned the wolves against their rightful king. At that moment, the great doors of the hall slowly opened. Every head turned. Alara entered quietly beside the old librarian. She wore the same simple clothing she had always worn. No jewels, no crown, no symbol of power. Yet behind her came something that made every voice disappear. The wolves. Dozens of them walked through the massive doors without a single growl. Their heavy paws echoed softly across the polished stone floor. They ignored every noble. They ignored every guard. They surrounded neither throne nor servant. Instead, they spread themselves evenly throughout the hall, watching everyone, judging everyone. The largest scarred wolf stopped beside the Alpha King. Another rested beside Alara. The remaining wolves formed a silent circle around the gathered lords. No fear lived in their eyes, only perfect awareness. The old librarian stepped forward, holding the ancient book high enough for everyone to see. This council has been shown lies. Now it shall hear the truth. His voice remained steady. For centuries, our history has been incomplete. The first Alpha King never ruled alone. Beside him stood the first voice whose wisdom guided the wolves and reminded every ruler that strength without humility becomes tyranny. The hall remained frozen. The librarian opened the ancient book. Its pages carried marks older than any kingdom represented inside the chamber. He began reading. Each forgotten passage described the same sacred bond between the crown and the voice. Neither above the other, neither beneath the other. Together they protected the balance of the realm. Many nobles lowered their heads. Several older lords exchanged troubled looks. Fragments of those stories had survived inside their own family traditions. Stories they had dismissed as myths. The noble lord suddenly stepped forward. Enough. These are only old tales. Kingdoms are ruled by power, not songs. His words had barely faded when the scarred wolf slowly stood. Then every wolf inside the hall rose together. Not one had been commanded. Not one made a sound. Yet every pair of glowing eyes turned toward the noble. He stepped backward. Another step. Sweat formed across his forehead. For the first time in many years, the man who had manipulated kings understood what true judgment felt like. The Alpha King walked toward him. There was no hatred upon his face, only disappointment. You believed loyalty could be purchased. You believed fear could replace honor. You believed history belonged only to those who wrote it. He stopped only an arm's length away. But the wolves remembered what men chose to forget. The noble looked around desperately. None of his allies moved. Several had already lowered their weapons. Others stepped away from him. The walls of lies he had spent years building collapsed in complete silence. Royal guards entered the hall. This time they did not wait for orders from frightened nobles. They looked only toward the Alpha King. He gave a single quiet nod. The guards surrounded the traitor. He offered no resistance. His confidence had vanished. As he was led toward the great doors, he turned once more toward the throne. His voice carried bitterness instead of strength. You may win today, but the kingdom will never accept change. The Alpha King answered without raising his voice. Change has already begun. No one inside the hall could deny it, because for the first time in generations the throne stood beside truth instead of above it. And outside the fortress walls, the long, mournful howl of every wolf in the kingdom rose together beneath the evening sky, carrying the news farther than any messenger ever could. Morning arrived without the sound of alarm bells. For the first time in many days, the fortress woke beneath a peaceful sky. Golden light poured across the ancient walls and painted every tower with warmth. The cold weight that had rested over the kingdom slowly faded like mist beneath the rising sun. Soldiers walked their patrols with relaxed shoulders. Servants smiled without fear of being punished for the smallest mistake. Even the birds returned to the castle gardens as though nature itself had been waiting for this quiet morning. The Alpha King stood alone upon the eastern wall where the first sunlight always touched the fortress. Below him the forest stretched beyond the horizon. Gentle winds moved across the endless sea of trees while distant wolves disappeared deeper into their ancient home. None remained near the castle now. They had returned to the wilderness because their purpose had been fulfilled. The king watched them until the last silver shape vanished between the trees. A soft voice interrupted the silence. "They trusted you again." The king turned. Alara stood a short distance away carrying a small basket filled with fresh bread. She still wore the same simple clothes from the kitchens. Nothing about her appearance had changed. She had refused every offer of fine dresses and noble jewels. She had accepted no title. She had asked for no reward. The Alpha King smiled quietly.
"No,"
he answered with calm honesty. "They trusted us." Those simple words carried more strength than any speech he had ever given. Alara walked beside him and looked toward the distant forest. "Do you think they will ever return?" The king looked toward the mountains. "Only when the kingdom forgets its heart again." Neither of them spoke after that. Some silences carried more meaning than conversations. Far below the fortress, the gates opened wide as people from nearby villages entered carrying gifts of grain, fresh fruit, flowers, and handmade blankets. They had not been summoned. They came because hope had returned to the land. Families who had spent years fearing the royal court now walked through the gates without trembling. Children laughed while chasing one another across the courtyard. Elderly villagers stopped to admire the ancient stone walls that once seemed cold and distant. The Alpha King left the tower and walked among them without royal guards surrounding him. At first the people could hardly believe what they were seeing. Their ruler moved through the crowd like an ordinary man greeting farmers, craftsmen, and mothers carrying sleeping children. An old blacksmith stepped forward. "Your Majesty, for many years we believed the castle belonged only to kings. Today it feels like it belongs to the kingdom." The Alpha King placed one hand upon the old man's shoulder. "It always should have." Those standing nearby heard his answer. The words spread quietly through the gathering. Not as an order, as a promise. Inside the kitchens, another beautiful change had begun. The servants no longer worked beneath constant fear. Windows stood open, allowing fresh mountain air to fill the warm rooms. Laughter slowly returned between the sounds of baking bread and boiling soup. The oldest servant watched Alara knead fresh dough just as she had on countless mornings before. Nothing about her work had changed. She still hummed while preparing food. She still smiled at everyone. She still thanked those who helped her. The old woman gently shook her head. "You could have lived like a queen." Alara smiled without stopping her work. "I was never searching for a throne. I only wanted a place where people could breathe without fear." The old servant quietly wiped tears from her eyes. Outside the kitchen window, one young wolf appeared for only a moment. It looked inside before disappearing back toward the forest. Alara smiled as though greeting an old friend. The bond no longer needed constant presence. It lived inside the kingdom itself. Several weeks passed. The fortress slowly transformed. The false advisors were replaced by honest men and women chosen for wisdom instead of family names. Old laws that protected only the powerful were rewritten. Forgotten records hidden inside dusty archives were placed where every scholar could read them. Children throughout the realm learned the true story of the first Alpha King and the first voice together. History no longer belonged to those who controlled it. One evening the Alpha King climbed the highest tower once again. The old librarian joined him, carrying no books for the first time in many years. The old man looked across the peaceful kingdom below. "Your Majesty, do you regret learning the truth?" The king thought for a long moment before answering. "The truth cost me certainty, but it gave me something greater." The librarian smiled. "Wisdom." The king slowly nodded. "Wisdom." The wind carried the scent of pine forests across the valley. Far beyond the mountains, the sun slowly disappeared beneath the horizon, painting the sky with deep shades of gold and crimson. The Alpha King closed his eyes for a brief moment. He remembered the proud ruler he had once been. The man who believed loyalty could be inherited. The man who trusted titles more than hearts. That man no longer existed. He had not become weaker. He had become complete. As darkness gently settled across the kingdom, the first stars appeared above the ancient forest. Then from somewhere far beyond the trees, one lone wolf lifted its voice toward the night. The howl was calm,
Strong.
peaceful. Another answered from a distant hill. Then another. Soon the entire forest sang beneath the stars. Not as a warning, not as a call to war, but as a promise that as long as truth and humility walked beside the crown, the kingdom would never stand alone. And within the warm light of the castle kitchens, Alara quietly hummed the same forgotten melody that had changed the fate of an empire. This time the song no longer awakened hidden secrets. It became the heartbeat of a kingdom that had finally remembered who it was. A full year passed before the people realized how completely their kingdom had changed. The change had not arrived through war or fear. It had arrived quietly, one honest choice after another. The markets grew louder with laughter than with arguments. Farmers harvested their fields without worrying that corrupt officials would steal their grain. Children ran through village streets pretending to be wolves and kings together because they no longer believed strength belonged only to those wearing crowns. Hope had become something ordinary, and that made it more powerful than any victory won by a sword. The Alpha King never allowed himself to forget the lessons hidden inside the ancient book. Each month he left the fortress without royal ceremony and traveled through distant villages with only a handful of trusted companions. He listened more than he spoke. He sat beside old shepherds who had never entered the royal court. He shared simple meals with blacksmiths whose names had never appeared inside noble records. Every journey reminded him that a kingdom was not built from stone walls or golden thrones. It was built from countless ordinary hearts beating together. Wherever the king traveled, another story followed him. People whispered about the quiet woman who still worked inside the castle kitchens. Many expected her to become a queen. Many believed she would rule beside the Alpha King. None of those stories became true. Alara chose the same life she had always known. Every sunrise found her lighting the kitchen fires before anyone else arrived. Every loaf of bread she baked carried the same care as before. Young servants gathered around her not because she held authority, but because peace seemed to follow wherever she walked. She never spoke of destiny. She never spoke of ancient bloodlines. She simply reminded people that kindness could be stronger than pride. One afternoon, a frightened young servant accidentally dropped a heavy basket filled with fresh fruit. Apples rolled across the stone floor in every direction. The girl froze in fear, expecting harsh punishment. Under the old rule, a mistake like that would have earned cruel words, or even worse. Instead, Alara knelt beside her. She picked up the first apple and smiled. Everyone dropped something before learning how to carry it. Soon, every servant joined them. Within moments, the floor was clean again. The young girl looked at Alara with grateful eyes. That small moment traveled through the castle faster than any royal order. People slowly understood that greatness did not always stand upon a throne. Sometimes it knelt beside someone who had fallen. As autumn arrived, the forests surrounding the kingdom glowed with deep shades of gold and crimson. Leaves drifted gently through the cool air, covering old paths with bright color. The Alpha King rode alone toward the great oak, where everything had changed on that unforgettable night. The ancient tree stood as proudly as ever. Its roots reached deep into the earth, guarding the weathered stone hidden beneath moss. He dismounted and walked forward. The carving remained untouched. The first voice shall guide the one who wears the crown. The king rested his hand upon the old stone. This time there was no confusion inside him, only gratitude. Behind him, soft footsteps approached. Alara had followed quietly through the forest, carrying nothing except a small lantern. She smiled as she looked toward the ancient tree. It feels peaceful now. The king nodded. Because nothing here is hidden anymore. They stood together, watching the wind move gently through the branches overhead. No titles separated them. No walls stood between them. Only shared purpose remained. Suddenly, a familiar sound drifted through the forest. A low, gentle howl. They turned together. Upon a nearby hill stood the scarred wolf. Older now, calmer now. It watched them for several quiet moments before lifting its head toward the fading sky. One by one, other wolves appeared among the trees. Not gathering because danger had returned, gathering because the bond endured. The Alpha King smiled. The wolves no longer needed to remind him who he must become. He had finally become that man. Winter arrived, and with it came the annual gathering of every village leader inside the fortress. The great hall filled once more, yet its spirit had completely changed. Nobles no longer stood apart from farmers. Craftsmen spoke freely beside generals. Every voice mattered because the Alpha King had learned that wisdom often arrived from unexpected places. As the meeting ended, an elderly woman from a distant mountain village slowly approached the throne. "Your Majesty," she spoke with gentle confidence. "People say this is the strongest kingdom in the world." The king smiled softly. "Strength is easy to lose." She nodded. "Then what protects it?" The Alpha King looked toward the open doors where snow gently covered the courtyard. Beyond them he saw Alara crossing the castle grounds carrying warm bread toward a group of hungry children. Nearby several wolves rested peacefully, without fear and without chains. He answered without hesitation. Truth remembered, humility practiced, and hearts that refused to forget each other. The old woman smiled with quiet satisfaction. That answer will outlive every crown. As night covered the kingdom one final time, the castle windows glowed warmly against the snowy mountains. Families gathered around their fires, telling children the story of the servant who hummed while she worked and the Alpha King who found his way back to wisdom. The tale was no longer remembered as the story of wolves choosing a servant. It became the story of a ruler who learned that the greatest kings are not those who command loyalty, but those who earn it every single day. Far above the silent fortress, the moon shone brightly over the endless forest. A peaceful chorus of wolves rose beneath the stars, carrying across the valleys without sorrow and without warning. It sounded like gratitude. It sounded like home. And as long as that song lived within the mountains, the kingdom would remember that true power was never born from fear. It was born from the courage to listen even to the quietest voice.